Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. My name is Sebastian Moore.
And I'm hilary.salt.
And today we are joined immediately by a guest. Our first guest in person. So welcome, Joan.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Yep.
Joan started up a group in Manchester it's now called Politics in Pubs. And that's how Hilary and I both know Joan. We're going to start off today with Bring Me Solutions because we've run into some technical difficulties and we've decided it's going to be a lot easier to start with Bring Me Solutions. So we're going to have a complete switch up for the episode today. So we're going to start with Bring Me Solutions. Joan is going to talk about her group and what it does for public discourse here in Manchester and across the country because they've expanded. And then we're going to move on to Culture Club. And after that, Joan is going to leave us and Hilary is going to talk a little bit about working from home and the impact that's had on the economy.
That's right.
And I'm going to talk about Quangos. So let's get going. Joan, tell us a little bit about your group.
So Politics in Pubs, we started probably, I lose track now, so I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I think it was about 2021, but don't quote me on that for the moment. But it's part of the reason that I'm a bit vague is that we grew out of the Brexit period, so after the referendum and the extremely long time it took for it to even look like it was going to be implemented. So a few of us set up Levers of Manchester, and that was part of a national grassroots organisation started by a young woman who lived in London. Once, in theory, Brexit actually happened, we left the EU, we thought, those of us that were still sort of kicking our heels around, once COVID hit, we were still doing a few Zoom things online. And after a while, I thought, look, I'm not going to keep going as sort of so-called the organiser, unless I've got people willing to help. And I think that's always healthier anyway. So we had a discussion about it, and unanimously, the people who came to the first in-person meeting during the COVID period all said they wanted to carry on. And the reason was that what that whole struggle to get Brexit, at least in theory, implemented, showed to us was that there was this huge gap between politicians and the people they're meant to represent. And we were all interested in politics, and we all felt that we ought to be talking about it and be more active. And what seemed to be happening was it was becoming increasingly difficult to do that. Friends and family of virtually all of us would sometimes say, I don't want to talk about that. In the most extreme cases, some people absolutely ostracised people because they just disagreed with what was being said.
I think lots of people lost friends over the whole Brexit discussion.
Yeah, sorry. And it really blew my mind that people felt that they couldn't carry on with the friendship. But it also concerns me hugely that people didn't, if the minute something might be said about a topic, so whether it was Brexit or whether it's net zero or whether it's trans rights or whether it's all sorts of things, lots of people say, well, don't want to talk about that. And it's almost become, and I think that is incredibly unhealthy. So there's two things there, I suppose. But anyway, that's a very long introduction about so we decided to keep going. We then took another little while to come up with the right name, and we hit on Politics in Pubs because we tended to meet in the pub. And it just basically was what it says on the tin as a title, and got our website set up. And then since then, we've got a group in Newcastle, which are doing really, really well, a group in Sheffield doing well, a group in Edinburgh that's only just started. And also on our website, we try to link up with other groups that are very much for, the right to be able to speak openly and freely, to be sort of taking responsibility would be one way I put it, and trying to keep trying to counteract that notion of we shouldn't be talking about these things. We should just hunker down.
So let me just read you a little bit off the website. So it says, what are we? We are a group of people from across the political spectrum who are interested in politics and value the freedom to question and to speak openly. We provide opportunities for debate without censorship, and we want to live in a successful, independent Britain. Now, one thing I really like about Politics in Pubs, and the reason that I was so attracted to it and have been coming for 2 years nearly, is that means a lot to me, finding something that we can agree on and say, okay, we might disagree about the specifics of these things, and some of us might be Remainers, some of us might be Leavers, but we can agree that we should be openly discussing these things, and we all want the same thing at the end of the day, which is that successful, independent Britain. I think that's something we should be able to rally around, certainly the vast majority of the public, so that the attempt to find some sort of consensus, and I think you only do that by meeting up with people in person. I don't think it's productive to be arguing on forums and WhatsApp groups. I think you need to be meeting up in person. So that really appeals to me. I wanted to ask you, Brexit occurred quite early on in my political life as an adult, but it did seem like it was the first thing that really divided people. Was there anything before that you thought had similarities to Brexit in terms of how it divided up people?
From what I've read, more than my own experience, the referendum about Scotland, I think that was very, very divisive as well. I think you had a similar thing of friends and families sort of falling out hugely. And again, I think that's a really funny one, because people voted that they wanted to stay part of Britain, and yet so often since 2014 it's presented as the people of Scotland want independence. It's sort of it's a bit like the Brexit thing. Whatever the vote result was, actually the reality is this, and people go, what? It doesn't really make sense. And people are being fed, that feels like you're being fed, and for want of a better word, a narrative that doesn't fit reality. So that was one. But I grew up in Belfast, and in many ways I had a wonderful childhood, a really happy childhood. But I was 11 whenever what's often termed the Troubles began. And my teenage years went through, the 70s. And when I came to Manchester as a student, and I thought I was only coming for 3 years, I realised that you could say what you wanted to say. As a young student, it was just mind-blowing, because I had learned that by habit in Northern Ireland, you had to be really careful about what you said. One, it could get you in danger, but also you might offend someone. And so you spoke in little tiny sort of bunkers, perhaps openly, but then in perhaps company that you didn't necessarily know so well, and certainly what was called mixed company, i.e. Protestants and Catholics, you were a lot more careful about what you said. And that was just a learned behaviour. And so whenever I realised, actually, you didn't have to be like that. You could say something and maybe get it completely wrong, and hear when someone else says something, and then think, oh yeah, and actually really learn, and learn how to think and learn how to hear stuff you didn't agree with. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And it was such a real thing. So for me, that I've always been really passionate about that importance of open debate, because I do think that self-censorship in Northern Ireland when I was growing up was hugely damaging. It held things back a huge amount, I think.
Just to go back to your question though, Sebastian, I do think there was something kind of qualitatively different about the public debate over Brexit that perhaps certainly in this area I hadn't seen before, where, as we say, it really got very, very contentious and very personal. And, I know lots of people who lost lots of friends. And before that, there would have been things that we disagreed about really significantly and really, serious things that we disagreed about. But you wouldn't think of stopping being somebody's friend about it. So I do think Brexit in this country was one thing where it became this kind of really visceral, emotional reaction to political discussion. I think that was a change in public debate. I think the good thing about politics in pubs, so I've been to a few of your meetings as well, Joan, and it is, I find it really stimulating because a lot of the meetings I go to is a lot of people agreeing with each other, whereas in the politics in pubs meetings there is a real, spectrum of opinion and people who I significantly disagree with. But it's a really, I don't want to say safe space because that's kind of the opposite of what it is. It's a dangerous space where anybody can say anything, but it's a space where people all have a drink together afterwards, which I think is what we're really missing in lots of other areas of society.
Yeah, I remember the first time. So I found out about your group through a mutual friend of ours, American Rob, and he runs a group called Cancelling Cancel Culture. And I remember the first time I went to that, and the premise of his group is to sort of push back against cancel culture, which is sort of deplatforming people you disagree with. And I remember having this amazing sense of relief. And I would say that I don't have any particularly extreme opinions, but it was an amazing relief to think, I can say anything and it will be okay because other people can tell me I'm wrong and they can disagree with me, but I'm not going to get cancelled or I'm not going to get shouted at for just voicing my opinion. And that notion of free speech, like you were talking about, being able to share your opinion in a room full of people I think is an amazing thing to have. How do you prevent your group from becoming an echo chamber?
I think that's a really, really good question. It is something I worry about a bit because it was great to hear from you, Hilary, that you find it's a full spectrum, because I don't think it is quite. I think we do our best, and there's probably other things that we could think about doing, but we do our best to attract as wide a view of opinions as possible. As I explained, we did grow out of a group of people that all were for Brexit, so we're delighted that people like you, Sebastian, come who weren't at the time. But I think we can err on the side of becoming an echo chamber if we're not careful. But all we can do is keep doing it. I went to a free speech union event in Belfast. I still go back quite often, and there was a journalist in the audience who did a bit of a hatchet job on the event, really. He said that, as expected, the panel was largely right-wing. He might have said far right, I can't remember, and unionist. And one of the women who organised it, was involved in organising it, said it just made her so cross because they invited so many people and the only ones that agreed to come were the ones that came. So it wasn't like so it's the same with us, really. I think you were at one where a young chap came, and he was at the first time, and he was speaking very much in support of Palestine, and we had speakers who were talking from the point of view of Jewish people in this country and Israel and Palestine, what's going on there. And I was delighted that he came, but lots of people wanted to shut him up. So I had to chair quite strongly, really, because even though we all say that it is for free speech, some people's natural inclination is when they hear something they strongly disagree with, they think, yeah, that shouldn't be allowed to be said. And I have to say, no, it's important.
It's easy to espouse, but it's hard to live by.
Yes. And but it's important that we live by it. It's I think it's a thing that you can learn as well. I think things like Battle of Ideas are really, really good at people learning that. It's a way where you can hear things you don't agree with, but wait your turn to come back.
And I think that the requirement for a quite courageous chair is quite important in a lot of these situations. So people are quite emotionally incontinent, aren't they, these days? So as you say, they might not want to cancel somebody who's saying something that they disagree with, but they do heckle and boo. And sometimes I think it's really important just to say, you'll have an opportunity to respond, but what you must do is be respectful in hearing somebody else's view.
Exactly. It's really important.
I think you've touched on a really, really good point, which is that it's easy for us to break everything down into a binary, which I think everybody's tempted to do nowadays. And it's easy to say, I'm pro-free speech, you're pro-cancelling. But actually there's more to do. You know, if you are pro-free speech, there's still, it is a thing to work on in terms of being able to converse with people you disagree with and being able to include them. And like you mentioned with this guy that was speaking in favour of Palestine, it is how do we as a group make sure we're welcoming to people that might not have the same opinions of the people present. Just on sort of going back to the theme of this segment of Bring Me Solutions, it just occurred to me that if the problem here that we're discussing is how the public are informed about issues and what the state of public discourse is in this country, and the solution that you're suggesting is one that already exists. So I think that's the first time we've had where you've actually gone out and, you know, through a process, because like you said, it started off as something different, but there is a solution here. And it's not the only solution, there will be others, but going and joining a group where you can have conversations, I've learned lots from coming to your group, and that is something we can do to improve the state of public discourse. Yeah,
absolutely. And in fact, it's not rocket science. I mean, we started up, but we've since discovered lots of other groups that have different names where people have tried to do something similar, and we're trying to link as many of these groups up on our website. So if anyone knows of a group, please get in touch with us. It's Politics in Pubs, all one word, .org.uk.
So I wondered if you could, sorry to put you on the spot, but if you got any names to hand of guests that you've had at Politics in Pubs, because the format for anybody that's wondering is you generally will invite somebody to come and give a talk, and then people can interact and discuss, ask questions. So a couple of names that spring to my mind are Peter Ramsey, who told me about the SDP. So he's a university lecturer in London, and he came and spoke about sovereignty post-Brexit. There was a chap, I think the Scottish chair of the Electoral Reform Society, came and spoke. Any others that spring to mind?
Yes, probably. I won't get their names right, which is just sort of because I'm on the spot, but it's all up on our website because we do a summary of each session. But just to collect the Electoral Reform Society, he might be Scottish, but he lives in London, and he is a director, I think, of it's not just Scotland, but he was quite involved with the Scottish electoral system. But anyway, we've also had Dennis Hayes, I think that's his correct name, from
Dennis Hayes, the director of Academics for Academic Freedom.
That's it. Thank you very, very much. Yeah. And actually, that was a really good example of where some people strongly disagreed with some of what was being said, which is really surprising, you know, considering, because I think there was some of our attendees sort of felt, yes, they're really for free speech, but there are limits, you know, and he was
And he pushed. This is the interesting thing about this is that, you know, from the outside, Politics in Pubs is a massively pro-free speech group.
Yes.
But you get somebody that's a pro-free speech absolutist come, and he really pushed us. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, wow, maybe I'm not so pro-free speech.
Yes.
You know, because there were certain things that I thought, oh, that means you've got to accept that. And is that acceptable? You know, the arguments about... Politics in Pubs is in quite a Jewish area.
Yes.
And the biggest Jewish area outside of London, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we were saying that people, you know, shouldn't be able to go down the street and shout awful things about Jewish people.
Yeah.
You know, so it is a really challenging thing. So if anybody's listening to this thinking, I want to get involved in something like Politics in Pubs, go on the website. We'll put a link in the description. As you said, there are groups all over the country now, and as well as friend groups, I don't know what we call those, sister groups.
Yes.
That are slightly different, but they still have that central tenet of being pro-free speech, which I think is crucial.
And quite importantly, we can help anyone who's interested in setting up a group that, if there isn't one already in their own area, we can definitely help. They can do what we've done because, as I said, it's not rocket science.
So that brings us on to Culture Club. And Hilary, what did you have to bring for Culture Club today?
Well, it kind of fits in with the pubs theme, really, because I wanted to talk about Burns Night. So it's Burns Night this weekend. We're recording this on Friday, so it's tomorrow, Saturday the 25th of January. So this is the anniversary of the birthday of Robbie Burns, the Scots poet. And many people might be attending events to celebrate this. But I when I mentioned it to a couple of people I know, they were saying, "Oh, what is that? What, tell me about it." So I thought I might just say a few words about it. I have no Scottish roots, so I have no qualifications really to talk about this. But I did think I would just run through the kind of choreography of what happens in a Burns Night event. So obviously bagpipes have a big theme here, so the guests are piped in. There's a chairman's welcome. Before the meal they say the Selkirk Grace. Do you know that, Sebastian? Shall I try it? I mean, I'm going to lose friends here because when I try a Scottish accent it won't work. So without the Scottish accent I'll just give it a go. So some ham eat and cannot eat, and some would eat that want it, but we ham eat and we can eat. So let the Lord be thanked.
Lovely.
That's the Selkirk Grace. Then there's the meal, which is, of course, haggis. So the haggis is piped in again. There is the address to the haggis, which I'm not going to try. It's very long and it is very Scottish. But it's the thing that starts with the fair fire on his suncy face, great chieftain of the pudding race. I won't go any further.
And you might not have any Scottish roots, but you have a certain partiality towards haggis.
I love haggis, yes, yeah. Although I don't like whiskey, which I know loses me friends again. And then there will be some recitations of some of Burns' poems, the Immortal Memory in that section. And then the laddies lead a toast to the lasses, thanking them for the food and producing the meal. And then the lasses give a toast to the laddies. I think all of this is quite banterish and, you know, taking the mickey a little. Then there's a vote of thanks, and then there is Auld Lang Syne. This is the other occasion on which people sing Auld Lang Syne. So if anybody is going to a Burns Night celebration, please do enjoy it. And don't drink too much whiskey.
And we are having a Burns Night celebration, are we not?
We are meeting tomorrow, yes.
So the northwest region of the SDP are having a meal. We're going on a walking tour, then having a meal. So if you're in the northwest, join the SDP and you can come to future events like this.
Great. And I like haggis, I like haggis a lot, especially if it's very peppery.
Yes, yeah. And the neeps and tatties as well. Yeah.
But the whole community feel of it as well is lovely, isn't it? You know, and the sort of, I really like the grace as well. It's sort of recognising that some people can't eat, and that's not right.
Absolutely, exactly.
Yeah.
And on that note, you wanted to talk about Incredible Edible.
Yes. So that wasn't a deliberate link, but so I'm bringing to the table an organisation called Incredible Edible, and like Politics and Pubs, it's another very, very much a grassroots organisation. It was started, not quite sure when, possibly so early 2000s, I think, in Todmorden, which is between here and Leeds, to be very parochial. And it was started by a couple of women, and they were concerned that they felt that their town was becoming so fragmented and it was losing a lot of what it had in terms of a real sense of community. So, I mean, that's echoed in so many places. So they thought about what they could do rather than demand, why aren't the government doing something? Why doesn't someone do something? And they decided in the end that everybody has to eat. And eating together is a really, just like Burns Night, is a really good way of cementing friendships, but also creating a great sense of community. So they thought they would do food projects that were for everybody, and it would be growing food. But the big slogan was, we don't just grow cabbages, we grow community. So that was the whole idea of it. So in 2010, I and a guy called George Herron, who lived up then in Prestwich, were chatting about this. And we both independently thought it'd be great to have something like that in Prestwich. So we decided to give it a go, and we had a public meeting for interest, and we got started. And so since then, sort of the 15 years since, we've got a whole range of projects. We've got sort of community orchards. I'm involved in a small project in a local park where we've got 3 raised veg beds beside the children's swing park. It's very public. And a group of us, all volunteers, the whole organisation, the way we're doing it in Prestwich is completely volunteer-led. For the moment, we're not against eventually possibly having a paid organiser. But for the 15 years, it's all been volunteer, organised and run. And that's really the public face. But we also have much bigger projects, one in a large park where we've got 2 polytunnels, all sorts. But we've got forest gardens, which someone can look up, see what they are. It's quite a different way of growing food, and a community allotment. So all quite a number of projects, and it does create a much greater... I know people now that I didn't know, even though we live locally, didn't know. Across from my house, we've got herb beds, raised beds on unused land, and we've got herbs, and I do go out and pick the herbs. And I thought when we first started it, I would be talking more to neighbours as a result, but we tend to have it's a WhatsApp group. Often when I go and cut a bit of rosemary and a few bay leaves, there isn't someone else doing it at exactly the same time. But it has worked, in that I've got to know neighbours that I didn't know before. So again, I think it's a really good example of, you see a problem and you do something about it, and it's the power of small actions. And lots of people have loved it, and it's become international, and every local group works out their way of doing it. There's no blueprint. Yeah,
sounds fantastic. And I'm going to ask a very cynical question now, which is, you don't get anybody vandalising anything?
Right. So yes, we do, but on the whole, we try and play it down. So for instance, the 3 veg beds in a park that I mentioned, the early days, for some reason, someone took it upon themselves to bring a load of building rubble into the park, and they would have had to carry it, because you can't drive past the beds, and just tip it over part of the beds. But we decided, rather than make a big hoo-ha about it, we'll just clear it up and not say anything. And it was just bizarre. Someone was obviously very cross that these beds were happening, and it shouldn't be happening.
Why didn't you make a thing of it?
Because it's just given an outlet to something that's trying to stop something happening, whereas we decided we'll just carry on, and it didn't happen again. We have another project in Radcliffe, part of Bury, and they have had a lot of damage as a result of young people with nothing much to do, and so it's not necessarily malicious, but it is certainly very, very, very thoughtless. And they hang around in the area at night time, and they use what's called living hedges, but it's pieces of branches that have been used, a lot of them, that are put together to create a bit of and it's very wildlife friendly. And they're sort of like barriers, they're boundaries, but they're natural. But they're a really handy thing to make if you're going to make a bonfire and be able to sit around and do things that maybe you shouldn't be doing and be warm outside. So there's been that, and sometimes the fires have got out of hand and stuff in a dreadful way. So yes, and again, we're just trying to think, well, what can we do about it, rather than, oh, these terrible young people, sort of. We need more youth clubs and more things for people to do.
So I wasn't asking that question to kind of pour cold water on the idea at all. Yes. I just felt that some people listening might say, well, we can't have that around here because it would just be vandalised.
Yes.
So it's good to note that even though you have experienced that, it hasn't put an end to the project.
Yeah, and I think the majority of people like the idea. They might not all give up some time to volunteer, but they've always said, oh, you're doing a great job. Or, if we go past us in the park, I think they really like living somewhere where this is happening. You know, it sort of gives a sense of, even if they don't do much about it, they think, oh, it's lovely.
Yeah.
Well,
and it is.
Well done for being somebody that just gets on and does it,
Absolutely.
rather than talking about it. And you are the embodiment of our Bring Me Solutions segment, I think.
You are. Thank you,
very
Joan.
much.
Yeah,
Thank you
thank you.
both. Thank you.
So in our news section this week, Hilary's going to be talking about working from home and the effect that has on the economy and the culture. And I'm going to be talking about Quangos. So I think we're going to start with you, Hilary.
Yes.
So this has been in the news a little bit. There was a Panorama documentary this week.
Correct.
And Donald Trump, having been inaugurated as the US president, has signed a raft of executive orders, one of which was to mandate it so that federal employees must go into the office. So it's very pertinent at the moment.
It is. And the other thing from a UK perspective is that the new Workers' Rights Bill will make it easier for employees to request home working. So, you know, as now, when they request flexible working, an employer has to have a reasonable reason why they can't have flexible working, and the bill will make it the same for working from home. So an employer has to take a working from home request seriously and can only turn it down if they have, you know, reasonable grounds to do so. So that's why it's in the news. I don't know if you watched the Panorama documentary,
I did, yeah.
but one of the people on there was Lord Rose, who's the ex-head of M&S and Ocado and Asda. And he said, working from home is contributing to the economy's decline and creating a generation not doing proper work. So I think that's perhaps an example of the fact that this debate gets polarised very quickly. A bit the way we were talking about with when we were talking to Joan earlier, that it's kind of almost another one of those touchstone issues where people get very polarised and very emotionally attached to the discussion. So if you're one of the people who's kind of pro working from home, the kind of things you might say are, I'm more productive working from home. Employers need to learn to trust their staff more. I save commuting time. I can look after my children. I get distracted at work. Working from home means that employees are fulfilled and engaged and happier. And these are all arguments that are being used by those workers who are opposing employers wanting more people in the office more often. You might have seen that there's a few strikes from public service workers, the Office for National Statistics, the land registry staff, the civilian people who look after the Metropolitan Police. So all those kind of civil servants are in dispute with their employer over this. And in the private sector, there's perhaps less strike action, but there's a lot of action that people are taking to kind of be to push back against employers. So things like hushed hybrid, do you know what that is? So hushed hybrid is where people are meant to go into the office but don't really, and often managers connive with employees so that nobody does as much work in the office as they're meant to.
So this is something where their contract stipulates that they must be in for 2 or 3 days a week in the office, and in reality the manager just says, okay, it's fine, you just
absolutely. Yeah. There's some people effectively accepting lower pay to not come into the office, so giving up on things like bonuses. There's a concept of rage applying. So this is where somebody's asked to come into the office more often and they immediately fire off a lot of job applications to other jobs where they can perhaps work from home more often. Career cushioning. There's all these new phraseologies.
Gosh, I can't keep up with it all.
This is having a kind of a backup plan for what if you're made to come to the office more often, you've got another job kind of lined up almost. And then this is an old-fashioned term, sulking. So engaging in presenteeism is the way it's often expressed. So people go to the office, but they don't really pull their weight.
They do it begrudgingly.
Absolutely. So we can see it all that happening. And that's perhaps, explaining how the pro-work from home people are thinking. On the other side, the kind of anti-people, people who are anti-work from home, so the people like Lord Rose, they're saying things like workers are slacking, they're watching TV, they're doing housework, working from home causes mental health problems, low productivity. Being together increases creativity, and we're losing that from people working from home. People are not passing on skills to a new generation. They're not building relationships with colleagues and clients. Then it's very difficult to enforce a workforce culture, or to inculcate a workforce culture, might be a better way of putting it, when people are working from home. And some of the employers who are, putting forward those arguments are the people who are making staff come back. So JP Morgan, Santander, Boots, Amazon, JD Sports, Asda, all those people are pushing people to come back. And I said it gets very polarised. I should, to nail my colours to the mast, I am pro a return to the office. Perhaps not every day, but 3 or 4 days a week I think will be a better situation for us to be in. But I do think we need a much more nuanced debate about this. And we need to stop getting immediately polarised along those lines that I've laid out. So if we just look at some of those arguments that are put forward. So on productivity, I mean, everybody says I'm more productive at home. Now, if we look at UK productivity since the pandemic, I think we can all probably agree, even without looking at figures, that there's not been a massive surge in productivity. And if everybody working from home was more productive, that's what we would have seen. And I think, the kind of opposite is the case, that we've seen lots of organisations, big organisations and public services that don't seem to work at all. So I think it's hard to argue that there has been a big rise in productivity. But I don't think that by saying that, people should think that you mean that you think people are slacking. Because, my view is that lots of people are working longer and harder working from home. And that's why they think they're more productive, because that's what they're doing. But they're doing that because their work is harder when you're not with your colleagues in the office. And there's quite a few studies into how productive people are. And some of them do indicate that people get through the same amount of work as they do in the office, but they do it for longer hours. And I'm sure to some extent that's because people do stop and put the washer on. I think that's sensible for people to do that. But I do think it's also because you get stuck with something, and if you're in the office, you can say to your colleague, oh, how do I do this again? Or just remind me how to whereas if you're at home, you have to wait for an opportunity to call a Teams meeting or whatever. And, I do think you then put something down, you pick something else up to do. And, when you touch things a lot of times, it's always more inefficient. So I think working harder and being productive are not the same thing. And I think a lot of people are working harder, but not being more productive, actually being less productive.
Can I add in a term?
You can.
I might have just made this up, but mouse moving.
Yes.
You know what I mean by mouse moving?
I do. So I have been in the hairdresser where there's been another customer in the hairdressers who's had her laptop and she has just been moving a mouse to pretend she's working when she's actually having her hair done.
Yeah,
so
and I have friends, I will admit, I have friends that partake in this where we'll be doing something social and they say, hold on, I've just got to go and move my mouse, because it keeps them online and therefore their employer thinks they're working. And I think that's a good example of the fact that this debate is probably the wrong debate. And I think you're right to say it's nuanced. But this, to me, highlights that there's a deeper issue, which is that workers are very far removed from the output of their work. And I think that's a huge issue. Why do people feel that it's okay to be in a job where all you're doing is moving a mouse so that you can pretend you're working? Where has that dignity in work gone? I think these are the sort of questions we have to start looking at.
Yeah, it's that kind of Marxist concept of being alienated from your work, isn't it? I think the other kind of productivity challenge is that people aren't passing on skills and experience if they're not in the office. So even if a more experienced person, let's say they are more productive at home, what is happening in the office is that the new person learning the job is less productive. So overall, you're not collectively more productive. You will know as a teacher that there's this concept of a proximal zone of development. Oh, I thought you might have known that kind of pedagogical concept.
I have a large problem with pedagogical or what is it? What's the name for it?
Pedagogy.
Pedagogy.
I'm never quite
I'm
sure
thinking of a different word. There's a different
Pedagogy?
word that I remember I worked in a school and the head of the school kept using this word, and I turned to somebody at one point and said, "What is that word? I don't know what that means." Schools can be an environment where jargon phrases get thrown around. So go on, proximal zone of development.
Yes, so this is the concept that you learn most by working alongside somebody who's just a tiny bit better than you.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps for many of us, the way we experience that is in the gym. So it's really good if your gym buddy is somebody who's just a bit better than you are, because that pushes you on.
Yeah, you don't want to train with an athlete, do you?
No, and you don't want to train with somebody who's way less capable than you. It's having that, being very close in development that means that people learn more. And obviously for the person who's if your gym buddy is the person who's a bit better than you, there's not a lot in it for them to be working with you because you're learning and they're not.
Yeah.
But in a work context, you've got a collective responsibility to bring everybody on. So I think it's that we're losing when people work from home. So the younger people are not learning as quickly, and the business overall isn't as productive. Perhaps the other thing just to mention is that kind of almost spark of creativity. So I've got a quote from Steve Jobs. Is he still a tech bro? Does he count as a tech bro?
I suppose so.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe the OG tech bro.
Yeah. So he said, creativity comes from spontaneous meetings, random discussions. You run into someone and you say, "What are you working on?" And then you say, "Wow." And soon you're cooking up all sorts of ideas. And I think it's hard to recreate that in a working from home atmosphere when everybody's doing things in a very isolated way.
I completely agree with you. And I think the point you made about it being nuanced is so important, because when we're talking about this and we're discussing working from home, we're talking about huge tech companies and we're talking about writers. A close friend of mine is an aspiring writer. Of course he works from home. He's a writer. He needs to write and he needs a secluded space to do it. So in the situations where it makes sense, of course we should be employees should have, if the company is happy for them to do, and if they're happy for to do it, then brilliant. But I also agree with you that in a time when we're faced with such social isolation, the fact that so many people are working from home, I do think is a concern. Yeah, and I think that kind of brings me on to perhaps my final point, which is just around kind of team building and building up resilience as an organisation. So when you're in an office and you're working together, you do build up trust in each other. You forge those friendships and relationships and loyalties, and you do offer support and encouragement, and you also do a bit of pushing people on if they're skiving a bit, and I think that all that's exactly what happens in an office. And those kind of things do bind people together. And that does, I think, mean that people go the extra mile for each other. So, if George makes a mistake, you don't throw George under the bus. You all kind of rally round and you say, how are we going to put it right? And you do that because last week George helped you with something that you couldn't do. And when you work in the very isolated ways, again, I think it's quite difficult. The thing that happens in an office is you kind of have these office rituals, the tea making and the water cooler moments, I think they call them these days, don't they? Which kind of replenish people's emotional resources. And not having that, I think, is really problematic. So I always get a bit annoyed when people say, "Oh, well, when I'm at work, I get distracted. I talk to people." But that's what we call team building, actually. Engaging with your colleagues. Colleagues are not a distraction. That's what we call being a human. Absolutely, exactly. And I think we need to reinvent that, get hold of that. Part of your job is making that social glue that makes an organisation work better. So, I have nailed my colours to the mast there, but I would say that nothing I've said is about people are just slackers. I think it's an important debate that we have that is not about pointing the finger or criticising. It's about
saying how do we build organisations that really are efficient and productive and increase the wealth of society.
I found the Panorama documentary brilliant. I really, really enjoyed it because I think it revealed a lot of the competing arguments quite well.
Perhaps two more things just to say.
Yeah, go for it.
One is that just to key into something that you said before when you talked about people having a private life and a public life. And I think when people complain about commuting time, I think actually there's something to be said for a hard border between work and home, because that helps people to switch off. And I do think there's a bit of a problem with lots of organisations now where you never do switch off. I think learning to switch off is quite a good thing. The other thing just came across to me on that Panorama documentary was quite how disappointing the Employment Rights Minister, Justin Madders, was. He kind of felt he was saying some words that somebody had told him to say. And it was disappointing that the BBC interviewer didn't put a bit more pressure on him. He kind of felt like somebody who didn't really understand any of the issues and certainly didn't understand the nuance in the issues. He was just reading a script. I think we said before, we're often quite disappointed in our politicians, and I was disappointed in him.
Yeah, and I don't blame him because he is responding to the incentives that are there, and these ministers, that they're keen to climb the ladder, and therefore they have to kind of toe the government line, and he was, as you might expect, but doing it in a way that, I agree with you, didn't suggest that he had any sort of knowledge on the issue. And I think somebody that just uses the word right as a soundbite without sort of being able to elaborate on why somebody should have the right to work from home, I think is, telling.
Yeah, and I think that right to work from home, all it does is to increase the bureaucracy that businesses have to deal with. So employers who would have been very understanding and open to a discussion with an employee will carry on being, but they'll have to write a load of evidence as to why they're saying yes or why they're saying no. And those employers who wouldn't have been open to it probably still won't be. And nobody's going to be going around inspecting whether, these rights have been adequately respected. And for many people, doing things like taking employment tribunal cases is just not an option. So I do think that what a lot of these employment rights will do is just increase bureaucracy without making anything at all better for any worker.
Let me move on to Quangos.
Yes, you want to talk about Quangos, don't you? So just remind people what a Quango is, first of all.
A Quango, originally, it stood for a quasi-NGO, NGO being a non-governmental organisation. It's sort of evolved, and there's a term called a backronym, which is when you take an acronym and you sort of retroactively attribute meaning to it. And its new sort of acronym is quasi-autonomous NGO, which is a different thing. But it kind of has a broader scope of what fits into that category of Quango. So it's been in the news recently because Labour, since they've got in, have increased the number of Quangos. So there was a Telegraph article a few weeks back that said Labour has introduced a new Quango for every week that it's been in power. Now this kind of bucks the trend because Quangos, there used to be thousands of them back in the 80s. And they've been on a steady decline, especially in the coalition government 2010 to 2015. We had something that was termed in the press the bonfire of the Quangos. Now, this is interesting because it shows that Labour are doing something different to what the previous government have done. And we can maybe get into the reasons for that. But let me just kind of go through what the definition is and kind of establish a little bit about what these things are. Okay, so the government definition from 1997 says that a Quango is a body which has a role in the process of national government, but is not a government department or part of one, and which accordingly operates to a greater or lesser extent at arm's length from ministers.
Okay, yeah.
Now, the term, even though I said from that definition is not a government department, the term now gets used for three different entities, essentially. So I'm going to go through these three entities. We have non-ministerial government departments. So these are essentially government departments with no minister. Now, there's things like the Supreme Court, HMRC.
HMRC surely has the Chancellor as their minister.
So
no?
it's separate from it. So they don't have a minister overseeing HMRC directly. It's at arm's length from the Treasury.
Gosh.
Ofsted, so the Inspectorate of Educational Facilities, the Crown Prosecution Service, the Office of National Statistics, etc., etc. Now, the intention of non-ministerial government departments is essentially to protect them from political interference or where political control is unnecessary. Now, I actually really agree with this in certain cases. So the Office of National Statistics, for example, that's part of the UK Statistics Authority, which is a non-ministerial department.
So they get 2 mentions this week because they're one of the people on strike because they've been made to go back to the office.
Exactly. So they are protected essentially from political interference, which is great because we use the statistics that come from the ONS to judge our ministers and politicians. So I think that's really useful. Now, an example where political control is unnecessary is something like the Forestry Commission, which maintains our woodlands and such. It's an operational thing that I don't think really requires political oversight. There are policy decisions to be made about how we protect the woodlands and so on, but that is deemed to be something which can be undertaken by the people that run the Forestry Commission.
Sounds right, yeah.
And I agree with that. Now, let's move on to the other two. So we've got executive agencies, the second category. Now, these were something that was set up in the 1980s. So it was part of the Margaret Thatcher's reforms of the civil service. And they basically looked at government and said, there are a lot of things that government is doing which isn't really policy stuff and doesn't really need political decision-making, but it just needs to get on with these things. So I'll give you a couple of examples of executive agencies because I think that's kind of the easiest way to understand it. The DVLA is a good example. So that they are issue driving licenses. And I think that is something which it requires a lot of staff and they need to have their own processes and they don't want to go through all these sort of layers of bureaucracy of the civil service. So yeah, it's its own executive agency. The Prisons and Probation Service, again, something that it was found to be so bureaucratic because it was caught up in this civil service structure with the different classes of civil service and so forth. So they're essentially parts of government departments, but they're treated managerially and budgetarily separate. There are 20 non-ministerial departments, there are 38 executive agencies, and there are an unknown number of the next thing I'm going to talk about, which is non-departmental public bodies.
Okay.
The most recent statistic I could find is that there were 247. So an absolutely huge number. There used to be thousands, though.
Okay.
And this number is not dead on accurate, so it could vary, and they're being introduced and disbanded frequently. So these are essentially organisations that are publicly funded, and they provide a government service, but they aren't part of a government department. And these are the ones where, like you were saying with the executive agencies, these are the ones that I sort of raise an eyebrow with and think, I don't really understand them. Why are they part of government if they're separate from the decision making? That concerns me. So examples of this would be something like the Care Quality Commission, the Climate Change Committee, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the Pensions Regulator, and the absolutely absurd sounding British Potato Council, which was actually disbanded in 2008 and it was merged with the Horticultural Board.
So you should have said it was mashed together with.
Missed a sitter. Now, these are the ones that I think when people say get rid of the Quangos, I think they're probably referring to these slightly more than the non-ministerial departments or the executive agencies. And whilst, like you said with the Prisons and Probation Service, I think you can question the executive agencies and say, are they not doing things that the politicians should be doing? With non-departmental public bodies, the question marks are much bigger.
Yes, that makes sense, yes.
In order to sort of go into it a little bit, I would ask for your experience with the pensions regulator, seeing as you are somebody that worked in that field for all your career. What's your experience of the pensions regulator?
We had a lot of problems with the pensions regulator. So one of the problems when you try to regulate something is that it depends very much on what the statutory duties that you are given say. So the pensions regulator was given statutory duties, for example, to protect people's pensions. But it was never given a statutory duty to make sure people had a pension. And quite often, I would say my view was that the pensions regulator attempted to make sure pensions were protected, to make sure people never lost a pension by making sure people never had a pension. And so it's very much depends on exactly how those statutory duties are allocated to it. But I think many of these organisations exist because they're perhaps regulating something that may at one point have been something that was provided by government and perhaps would be better provided by government. So not pensions specifically, but if you look at things like the regulator of telecoms or railways or any of those, big, what you might say was, public service providers, even if they're not government run. When you separate out the running of a service and the regulating of a service, you kind of lose any balance between the two. So if you're running a railway and you're government, so you're kind of also your own regulator, you'll be weighing up all the time things like, how do we run this railway in an affordable way? How do we balance that against safety? How do we balance that against making sure that trains are on time? You're balancing all those different things. As soon as you put the regulation outside, then there's no reason why the regulator should worry about what it costs. So they're always going to say it has to be this safe and it has to be this frequent. And you lose that ability to, make those kind of commercial decisions. Perhaps commercial's the wrong word, but those practical decisions about how you balance all those things. And you're always pushed to be, the safest without thinking about any other considerations. And that seems to me why it's one reason why people get very frustrated with Quangos, because they do seem to be quite impractical often.
And one of the arguments of the existence of these non-departmental public bodies is that there needs to be a separation of political control from the organisations. And whilst I understand the argument of that, they were created by politicians in the first place. I think we should have a little bit more faith in our parliamentary system. And I know that is a difficult thing to say in 2025, but we should. And if it needs to be politically separate, something like I mentioned with the Office of National Statistics, I don't understand why it can't be a non-ministerial department, which makes sense that you have that arm's length nature which they talk about, which is very strange that they use this term technically, even though it's a metaphor. I always find that weird. So they have ALBs, arm's length bodies, but the idea is to have a bit of separation. I don't understand why they can't be an NMD, a non-ministerial department, why they have to be a non-departmental public body.
Yeah, and I think that one of the problems is that the further away things get from government, the harder it is to hold that body to account, isn't it? So in the last instance, the way we express our view of our politicians is by voting them out. And we never have any ability to vote out the head of the ONS or the head of the Bank of England, all these organisations where there's no democratic accountability. Those all seem to me problematic, which is why, as you say, whilst it might seem an odd thing to say that actually those things should be political, they should be political because if they are political, you can hold the politicians to account, whereas if they're not, there's nobody you can hold to account.
Absolutely, and I think that is a key theme of our political landscape of the last 20 years, maybe even longer, is that politicians are keen to outsource responsibility and outsource decision-making because then they won't be held to account for those decisions when they go wrong. I think this happened with the EU. So, we can't, sorry, that's not our fault. That's the EU. Yeah, our hands are tied. And I think this is happening nowadays with Quangos.
And on the other side, I do think it's also the case that there has been typically a public support for not leaving things in the hands of politicians, because people have lost faith in politicians and in politics. So I think we have to kind of work on both sides of that equation. One is to say we need to make the politicians better so that, people will have more faith in them. And, the one way to do that is by politicians taking responsibility for the things that they are responsible for. So those two things seem to join up to me.
Yes, and to use a crude analogy, if you're scared of heights, you don't just avoid bridges and tall buildings. The only way to get past that is by actually exposing yourself to it. So we have to expose our politicians to a little bit of responsibility so that we can hold them accountable. And I think this is certainly us as a party, the Social Democratic Party, we oppose this technocratic approach to government, which is the one where it says, we've got experts to do that. Don't worry. That's not our concern. We're going to outsource that to experts. And we say, no, we're going to hold you accountable. We've put you there because you said you're a party, you're a politician that can do something about our problems. So we want to be able to kick you out when you don't do it and when you don't solve the issues.
Yeah, there's that Michael Gove quote, wasn't there, that people only ever use the first few words of. So I think he said, we're fed up of experts. And that's all that people say when they quote him. But I can't quite remember exactly what the continued quote was.
We've had enough of experts from organisations with acronyms that have got things so wrong in the past.
So I think I continue to think that was a sensible thing to say, although almost always when people quote him, they are suggesting that he's kind of undermining expertise, which is exactly not what he was doing.
And I think there's a trend here. If somebody says get rid of Quangos, people say, okay, but which ones? Point to which one. And you can look through the list. The one that I've mentioned today, things like the Equality and Human Rights Commission, people will say, well, that sounds like it does something really important. And I think this is a similar thing to the health and safety argument. So when people make arguments for health and safety, it's very, very hard to counter, because I can't say, that's inconvenient, or that's going to cost me time or money, because the counter argument will always be, but this is life or death. You could die. And so when there are arguments where we don't understand the risks of not doing the thing, I think it's really tricky. So you might say, well, these things sound like really important entities. And I'd say, but there is a risk of maintaining the status quo. There is a risk of continuing to establish Quangos to do these things. And we have to understand that by continuing, we are acting out a risk. We have to be bold as a country and say, how do we want government to run things? What should the government do? What should it not do? We've got to start asking these questions and start taking action and being bold with what is in the government's hands.
Correct.
Well, I hope anybody listening wasn't too distracted by our change up in order. That was very disconcerting for me.
The technical problems were a bit of a challenge for us this morning, weren't they?
They were, but we're hoping to rectify those because we're developing our own studio.
Correct.
Which is
very
exciting. And hopefully we're going to film that, so we'll be able to upload the videos to YouTube. I'd like to thank our guest for today, even though she's no longer in the room. Thanks to Joan Kennedy, who set up Politics in Pubs, for coming on. I am going to be talking at Politics in Pubs next week, so if anybody's in the Manchester area and wants to come along to that, it's in Prestwich. You can find it on the website, which is in the link in the description. As always, if you've enjoyed the podcast, check out the SDP on sdp.org.uk. Like, share, do whatever to get it to reach more people.
Yes, we're really keen to build the number of people listening to this.
And if you've got any questions, email either of us. Our email addresses are in the show notes.
Thanks for listening. Bye.